I once read an amazing article by a woman. I'm sorry I forget her name. I wish I could quote her name, but she was for a long time a major player in the New Age movement and sort of mysticism and Age of Aquarius type stuff. And one of the reasons why she felt that that was the right place to be was because she thought that scientists were arrogant, that they had all these answers to questions they didn't have any right to have answers to. But with her New Age friends, she would sometimes raise questions about their beliefs. And she noticed a pattern emerging talking to her New Age friends versus talking to scientists, that scientists would sometimes say they didn't know the answer to something, and that her New Age friends would never say that. They had an answer for everything. And she realized, actually, science does claim to know the answer to some things, but there are other things that it very quickly admits it doesn't know the answer to. Dennett just gave you a laundry list of things. Where did the universe come from? Why is there any universe? Is there life after death? And he says, and science has no clue about any of these things, as if that's a bad thing. Scientists are extremely proud of the fact that we know some things, and we know there are other things we don't know. We know where the dividing line is between what we know and what we don't know because of good reasons. But it would be a mistake to think that religion is a different way of obtaining truth that is outside everything else. In fact, religious people have exactly the same epistemic standards as non-religious people do, except when they're talking about religion. But if I were God, my textbook would be perfect. If God existed, the one thing that if there were an omnipotent being that cared about us here on earth, I would expect clear instructions. I would expect a book that I knew exactly what it said, it was clear that it was right, and I would be able to follow it. If God did not exist, I would expect all sorts of different books. They would contradict each other. Some of them would be brilliant in parts. They would be silly in other parts. They would be uplifting in parts. They would be very depressing in other parts. They would be edited collections. They would be personal memoirs. They would all disagree with each other. Which of these two theories fits the data? Thank you.
You're, of course, quite right that on the 11th of September 2001, we were forced yet again, as we are all the time, to confront the fact that faith by itself doesn't deserve respect, as we keep saying it does, that faith on its own is another form of fanaticism or substitution of belief for reason, and that's a sign of what a poorly evolved primate, mammalian species we are. The rabbi earlier appeared to pour contempt on the idea that we should think of ourselves as animals. Well, again, evidence counts, ladies and gentlemen. We are half a chromosome away from being chimpanzees, and don't you think it shows? Yes, of course we are animals. We're I think, a qualitatively as well as quantitatively better primate, but primates is what we are, and we know it. We even have the DNA to absolutely establish it. Nothing to be proud of or ashamed of, but a fact not to be denied. Now, we're lucky that there were people on one of those planes who didn't pray at all. They got out of their seats and they said, we're not going to let this plane fly into the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. We're willing to give our lives to prevent people who are willing to commit suicide. In order to prevent that happening. No time to pray, time to act. Very important. That's what we should be grateful for. If they'd all fallen to their knees and invoked the deity, the plane would have hit the Capitol on an election day, by the way, primary day in New York, and I think during a joint session of both houses of Congress. But it's not all bad news, because it does mean that those who crash planes full of living people into buildings full of living people, shouting that God is great and believing it's going to get them to paradise, aren't going to get there.
About that,
one is only
about
sorry.
That we agree.
One is only sorry, and very sorry in my case, that there's no moment, at the moment of their extinction, there's no moment when they think, damn, it isn't. But wishful thinking can't help that either. So my settled verdict on this is, they want to die, and I'm here to help them do so. And so should you be, and everyone in this room should be ashamed until they've done something to kill at least one jihadist or bring about the physical and moral and political and military defeat and humiliation of these people, and the God in which they believe, and the non-existent deity in which they dare to take permission to try and kill us all.
Christopher, have you ever prayed?
Once for a hard-on.
Isn't it a remarkable coincidence? Almost everyone has the same religion as their parents. And it always just happens to be the right religion. Religions run in families. If we'd been brought up in ancient Greece, we'd all be worshipping Zeus and Apollo. If we'd been born Vikings, we'd be worshipping Wotan and Thor. How does this come about? Well, of course, through childhood indoctrination. One by one, those ancient belief systems have vanished from the face of the earth, and we seem to get on just fine without them. Zeus with his thunderbolts, Apollo, Wotan, Thor with his hammer, Baal, Mithras, and Amun-Ra, all were once worshipped as gods. People believed in them, prayed to them, sacrificed to them. Children were brought up with them, told of their existence as a matter of undoubted fact. But nowadays, everybody agrees that no matter how sincere those believers undoubtedly were, they were deluded. Every one of those gods was a delusion, and so were countless other gods that human tribes have sincerely believed in all around the world. Some of us just go one god further. I'm a number 6. I'm an agnostic, but with the same level of belief in God as I have belief in fairies or unicorns. Bertrand Russell illustrated this with his parable of the celestial teapot. He pointed out that it is impossible to disprove the hypothesis that there is a china teapot in orbit around Earth, or around the Sun, between the orbits of Earth and Mars. We therefore all have to be agnostic about the teapot theory, but in practice we are all a-teapotists.
And the third point, which I think I could tie into this question, but it actually was inspired by Hans's first answer to the first question. He said, with a certain facetious air, you wouldn't expect to open up the Bible and see it tell you that elementary particles are representations of the gauge symmetry groups. And I would like to know, why shouldn't I expect that? In a more general feature, if I do believe that the Bible or some other sacred religious text is telling me anything true and non-trivial about the world, something that we have gotten from religious experience or revelation or direct contact with the deity or whatever it is, if there's something that we get that we could not have gotten by ordinary scientific explanation, why in the world didn't God tell us some useful scientific facts? I would claim that the only reason we don't expect to find useful scientific facts in religious texts is because we don't find useful scientific facts in religious texts. You might say, well, we didn't have the vocabulary 2,000 years ago to be told that elementary particles were in representations of the gauge groups. I would claim that God could have done it. He's God. God could write the world's most awesome textbook. He could have explained these things even a long time ago. And even if he chose not to, he could have said, you know what? The universe is billions of years old. He could have said, we're made of atoms. He could have said many, many true but non-trivial things at the time, and he never did. There's no religious tradition that really comes out and says remarkably true, interesting, non-trivial scientific facts long before science found them. And I think that if we're judging the two models, the two ontologies of theism versus naturalism, and saying what would we expect to be true under these two views of the world, if we didn't know the actual history of religious texts, I would have guessed that they would have told us something interesting and non-trivial about the natural world. Therefore, the fact that they don't, I count as evidence against that point of view.
Why is this of such concern to you, Dan? If my faith doesn't pick your pocket or break your bone, as Thomas Jefferson said, yeah, why should you care what I believe?
Well, exactly. I wouldn't accept that religious people care so much about what everybody else believes. Why do they care? Why do Christians care what Muslims believe? Why do Muslims care what Christians believe? And to me, the really dangerous thing about religion, and this is not everybody, of course, it's not half, thank goodness, but it's many, and that is the one thing that I think is really dangerous in many religions is that it gives people a gold-plated excuse to stop thinking.
To stop thinking.
To stop thinking. To say, I don't have to think about that because my religion says this is right, this is wrong, it's as clear as that, it's black and white, I don't have to think about this anymore. It's just a matter of faith. And we honor that. We say, oh, it's a matter of faith. I think we have to stop honoring people for stopping thinking. I think we have to say to people, fine, you have your faith, great. Your job then, your duty to your own faith, is to explain to those of us who do not share your faith why you're right about this. Let it be true that God told you. Let it be absolutely true. God told you this is the right way and these ways are wrong. Right. Your problem now is to explain to those of us that God didn't speak to why this is right.
This is actually an example from my book. If I told you that I believe that there was a diamond buried in my backyard that's the size of a refrigerator, it might occur to you to ask me why. If in response I gave the kinds of answers you hear from religious moderates, the answers that describe the good effects of this, of believing as I do. So I said things like, well, this belief actually gives my life a lot of meaning. Or, I wouldn't want to live in a universe where there wasn't a diamond buried in my backyard that's the size of a refrigerator. I mean, it's pretty clear that responses of this sort are deeply inadequate. They're worse than that. They are the responses of a lunatic or an idiot. I mean, by responding in that way, I would have disqualified myself for any position of responsibility in a first world society. Except you change the subject to religion, to the moral demands of an invisible superintelligence, to what happens after death, and all bets are off. Then you can say anything you want.